Welcome to the More to Story podcast. I'm so glad that you all have come along for this episode. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think you will find it interesting as well, because we all are at different stages in our life and we're serving people, we're interacting people at various moments, and they come in those moments with different perspectives. And so our guest, who I'm going to introduce in just a second, will help us think through those ideas. But first, I want you to know this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we do that through a host of programs, academic programs from bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees, and ministry topics. And then we also have certificate programs, a course of study program for the Global Methodist Church and the Primitive Methodist Church and a host of other denominations that we serve. So we'd love for you to check us out at wbs.edu. And when you do check us out there, you'll find out some interesting things too. For instance, some of you might find it really interesting that we have a program for lay people called Wesley Institute. And the Wesley Institute is a program that walks people through every book of the Bible in a year, and it starts in September. So people probably, when they're seeing this podcast, will have a chance to be able to check that out. And then there's also a theological track where we walk through major theological disciplines over 9 months. And then there are several other smaller, shorter Wesley Institute programs. So we'd love for people to check that out at wbs.edu. Also, at my website, andymillerthird.com, that's andymillerIII.com, I have a tool there that if you sign up for my email list, I'll send you. It's called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. And then there also are a few other things there. There is some mini courses and small group materials that are available. One is a study of heaven, hell, and everything in between, the afterlife. And then there also is a study of the book of Jude. And then there's a new mini course there on the doctrine of holiness. So I'd love for you to check that out if you're interested in the things that you find in this podcast. And I have been told that it's good for me to tell people to like and subscribe and to leave Apple reviews. That's something I haven't been asking lately. But I was clued into the fact that I have 2 negative Apple reviews now. And so that's kind of taking my score down. I don't know what that does in the algorithms, but if you enjoy the podcast, there's more than 300 of these that you can find at my website, andymillerthird.com, and on all the podcast platforms. I would love it for if you would leave a review. So therefore, I did my due diligence and I did what I was supposed to do for those people who are helping me with my podcast. All right. I am so glad to welcome to the podcast Dr. Chris Kiesling, who is a professor of Human Development and Christian Discipleship at Asbury Theological Seminary. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Andy. It's so good to be here.
Chris, I was at Asbury Seminary while you were there, but sadly, I didn't interact much with you, but my wife did. My wife and I went through seminary together, and she did an MA in Christian education, and she had several classes with you. And I found that your work with her there was something that often came up in conversations, particularly as we were raising and we have been and are discipling our children. So you've had more of an influence in my life maybe than you realize.
I'm glad to hear that, Andy. I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so that was why I was excited to see your book. And it actually came out last year. I thought it was new, like 2025 new. But with Baker, Discipleship for Every Stage of Life, Understanding Christian Formation in Light of Human Development. And when even in the way that I introduced you there, thinking about the way that you would come up in conversations that we would have, is that various stages of my kids' life, from even before they're born, these were things that the things you have taught and you've been working on probably for years. These were things that have made their way into this book. I'm curious, Chris, like how this all started to form in you personally, even before we get into the contents of the book. I know you go over this in your introduction about how you came to want to study this area with your work in ministry before moving toward the academy. So could you tell us a little bit of that story?
Sure. Yeah. Starting at a real simple level, Andy, I had a mentor who, when he went to seminary, said he really had 2 different kind of objectives. One was to understand people deeply, and the other was to know and to love God. And I thought that's a pretty good agenda for a seminary.
Yeah.
So knowing and loving God took me in the direction of biblical studies and theology, and understanding people took me into pastoral care and human sciences, kind of social science insights. Um, that became even more real to me when I was pastoring and was at a large downtown First Church, and would find that if I offered Bible study, I might get 8 or 10 folks that would respond. And yet there would be a therapist, marriage and family therapist, that would offer a weekend on something like boundaries, and
Yeah,
certainly
sure.
people would respond. And so I thought, gosh, what's this? What's the, this challenge of trying to say, gosh, here are these great theologians and great insights from biblical studies that I want to offer people, and yet they're also equally and even more so sometimes attracted to popular psychology or social science insights or those kind of things. And so I found myself pondering, um, why is it that folks in my congregation sometimes find more guidance from listening to Oprah than they do from
Yeah.
reading Augustine? Um, so that created this kind of a long-term kind of commitment to say, how can I understand what the social sciences, what research is telling us about the human condition, and how does that intersect with what we know about faith formation and kind of theology and biblical studies? When I wrote the book, it took me even deeper. And in some ways, I began the book by asking the question of, what are the institutions that follow you through the whole lifespan, through all of the stages of life?
Yeah.
And kind of coming to the deeper conviction that if salvation is holistic, if it seeks to redeem all of life, that the church may be one of the only institutions that holistically is concerned about every domain of a person's life, and also is interested right from the womb to the tomb. So at every stage of life, the church has been invested through Christian education, through the development, through the healing of persons. And so it just struck me as gosh, what opens to us if we start thinking about different stages of life, what the human sciences can tell us, and how those intersect with our own kind of theological convictions.
Yeah, I can see how that can be really meaningful as you're trying to put this together. Because ultimately, like if your goal is to serve people and to help them understand who God is, how do we end up communicating that in a way that really reaches them? This is it's challenging as a pastor at times when you see these kind of pop psychology pieces make their way in, and even like let's say like listening to some of that stuff myself, it's like, oh, okay, well, things and sermons can end up feeling like they can be more effective if you just give these 3 ways to have deeper friendships. Now, I'm not saying that's a problem, but there can be an overreach on the other side. Is that pastors then are sometimes cautious to even want to enter into the social science and human behavior disciplines because it seems, I don't want to say like it's sophomoric, but it might just seem like it's something that is beyond it, not as theological, so to speak. And somehow we miss each other like two ships trying to go in different directions.
Yeah, and I think there are places at which these inform each other, and there are other places at which you begin to ask some penetrating questions. Right? Is the goal of what's oftentimes assumed in human development and social sciences the same goal that comes out of our understanding of sanctification or holy living, those kinds of things?
Even just looking at some of the sources that you work with, like as you deal with like James Fowler and various other authors who are well known in these disciplines. I did a D-Min at a liberal seminary, and I was surprised at how much was focused on the the, the starting with the self,
Hmm.
right, and like how much of it came back to, and I did learn about something, and for instance looking at somebody like Edwin Friedman and these people, these type of writers were often at the center, at the starting point for their theological expressions. So like that's a little bit of my caution too, but your book has helped me a lot with this, by the way, like in these ideas. But do you sense some of that yourself, that sometimes that even the problems that we might have with looking at psychosocial development can sometimes lead us to think the answers are in ourselves too much.
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, that's not only the whole of the social sciences and in some ways psychology that focuses upon the self in particular. By contrast, I think we could say theologically, the emphasis has been on personhood. And
Yes.
it tends to take us more toward the direction of understanding ourselves in light of the image in which we're created in Trinitarian theology. And then we could spin that out too and say, again, what's the goal of the lifespan or the goal, what's the telos of human development? Oftentimes that moves in the direction of autonomy or
Right.
individuality, or those kinds of things, rather than toward sanctification or the offering of the self. And so even the place at which, do we move toward greater and greater self-fulfillment? Or is there a place for self-denial or for this transcending the self, moving beyond the self, out of love toward other people? So I think all of our, of course, in the American context, what's our notion of freedom? What's our notion of fulfillment? What's the good life? All of those questions become a part of the journey through the lifespan.
Yeah, I liked how in the very first chapter, when you talk about womb and infancy, you start off by quoting somebody who we both really appreciate, and that's Dr. Dennis Kinlaw.
Mhm.
And in thinking about the way he describes personhood, was really a helpful start for me. And it reminds me of like, what is the telos of our life? When I was in seminary, my very first semester, I went and spent 3 hours with him, and I was trying my very best just to hang in there to understand everything he was saying. And I don't think I did. And I actually recorded it on a tape recorder. Old, this shows how old I am, right? I had to play and record at the same time. I didn't have a phone where I could record it that way. And when I was with him, I went back and listened to that tape a while ago, and he said, like, what's the kind of goal of life? What's the point of this journey of sanctification? Something to that effect. And he says, this is it. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready to listen. And he said, if anyone would come after me, and I, okay, okay, I know this verse. And so I jumped in, and I'm sad to say, like, I interrupted him. Not a very smart thing to do. And so I was just trying to show him I knew some things, right? And I said, take up your cross and follow me. And then before I could even get those words out of my mouth, his finger was pressing up against my chest, and he was saying these words: deny himself, deny himself. And I skipped over that part. And what he was saying, I think, in that moment, is that part of the goal of life is to emulate the self-giving nature of the Trinity in our giving up of ourselves to in that sense find ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's right, Andy. Yeah, and so Kinlaw could say it so profoundly.
I know.
Yeah.
So but that chapter is really interesting to me. And I'm interested, what is it you start this journey thinking of even the womb, things that are taking place before, some people might even think like, oh, there's not much going on there. Yes. Like what's really happening? I mean, how do you address things like language and development? And you talk about object permanence and these type of things in dealing with emotions. What are some ways that we interact with people in their faith development when they're in the womb or as babies?
Yeah, love the question, Andy. So to bridge from Dr. Kinlaw, Kinlaw asked a question of why was it that why is it that God has chosen for every person after Adam and Eve to be born into this world as a baby?
Yeah.
Right. So we get this Genesis story of God
Yeah.
forming the dust of the earth, breathing into it the breath of life, and forming a human being. So here's the blueprint. So why not just keep doing that, right? Another human, another human.
Yeah, sure.
Or Eve is created from the rib of Adam. So Adam has some other ribs. Why not use that as the model? So
Sure.
what could he have had in mind by bringing every human being into the world as a baby? And Kinlaw's own answer to that is that because a baby comes into the world vulnerable and dependent, that the only way that they survive is if somebody outside of them acts in love toward them for their care, for building trust, for their provision, and that somehow this impresses the very nature of God, the Trinitarian God that looks after us, and so that these things become impressed upon a child. Well, what we know from social science is that even in the womb, there is a salubrious kind of environment. Some social scientists will say this revisits Eden unless there's a traumatic kind of birth. That we're formed in the womb in such a way that this great provision is provided for us, all of our sustenance, all of our nurture. Um, we do know from the social sciences that when if you speak or play music to a fetus, even as it's developing in the womb, and when they're taken out of that, their heartbeat seems to change if there's a recognition of the voice or the music that's around them. And so there's a lot to say that even from the very beginnings of the womb, that there's a place in which societal context relationships are beginning to form that child. I think we could also say that even at a cellular, hard word for
Yeah,
Texans,
it is. Me too. Yeah, yeah.
the way that cells even operate are that there's DNA coding within those cells, and every cell carries the chromosome of our body. But how a particular cell develops depends upon the environmental context that's around it. And so this, I think, sets the stage for saying, gosh, if we're created in the image of a Trinitarian God, and theologians historically have said, what are the elements of that of the image of God? And we get sometimes rationality or freedom of choice. But I think relationality has really been
Hmm.
what theologians have focused on, and to say that to be created in the image of God, that our very personhood depends upon how we're loved, and we come to know ourselves by being surrounded by a community of loving people. So that has a lot of implications for family, for marriage, for the whole trajectory of our lives. So I think that's the foundational concept that I was trying to plant in womb and thinking about faith development. The aspects of language and object permanence. So I love Walt Wangren was a Lutheran theologian who had a great kind of poetic way of saying that every child dances one dance with God. That is that um, children actually seem to come into the world with a potentiation for faith, and the most natural place for them to develop is as if God is as real to anything that's in their like clouds or in their environment. Um, so that if you find a child who's atheistic, they've probably been taught that, because
Yeah, sure.
a lot of things seem to say that children have this natural instinct, even before language arrives, that they seem to have this capacity.
Hmm.
Margaret then suggests that when the child develops, if they're surrounded in a community that offers them the language to make real what their minds have already engaged, that then it becomes real. He talks about it as naming, explaining, and containing their faith.
Hmm.
So the aspect of what a faith community offers in terms of a language and an understanding of faith becomes pretty profound in the child's development. If that's not there, then it becomes easy to dismiss it almost as if it's a myth or fairy tale or something else. So again, I think, gosh, where does a child learn about faith concepts? How do we learn about stewardship or gratitude or those kinds of things? I think it depends upon whether or not they're surrounded with it in their environment. So I like the question of how do we create a spiritual world for a child to inhabit? Uh,
Hmm.
that's by Karen Eust some years ago in her writing about child development.
So
Uh,
in that case, like what would be some things that people can do in creating that environment in their homes, but then also for pastors thinking about how they create environments in their churches?
A lot of interesting kind of work being done in that regard. So some of it, I think, is right. The designated spaces for worship, for modeling. One author talked about that whenever we engage in some kind of Christian activity, whether it's kind of acts of piety or acts of mercy, that it kind of opens a folder in a child's mind to say, this is what a follower of Jesus does. And
Hmm.
so I think all of those become significant. There are some places. There's an interesting children's ministry program, Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, that actually tries to say, how do we shape a worship environment, especially seeing it through the lens of the child? So everything in this environment might be located at the eye level of a child. There
Huh.
are things like liturgical aspects that a child can interact with. Maria Montessori was one who created whole classrooms. I mean, she's most known, right, for her education
Right.
the place. But embedded in her educational philosophy is that the hands are the instrument of the mind, and so the intentionality is to create everything so that it can be touched and handled and the manipulables. And so storytelling in that tradition is such that you actually create objects to tell the biblical story in such a way that the child then can imaginatively enter into the kind of objects that they're working with and enter into the story. So it uses wonder and imagination. So another
Yeah.
simple way is right to go on wonder walks. What is it that makes you kind of go ah or or
Yeah.
the sense of awe and amazement at God's creation? So those are kind of things immediately that come to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And your colleague, Kathy Stonehouse, of course, had an emphasis on talking about godly play. I know that was something she brought in from other places as well, but that was like really interesting ideas. I'm curious, like what you even think of the. I'm not trying to just slam on the contemporary church with smoke and lights or that sort of thing. Maybe that's even good for this environment. Maybe being able to see smoke, lights or screens, but there's something to me like I'm curious what you think of modern church environments. Then are they something we need to be thinking about more for children? Not just having it is, of course, some churches struggle to even have a nursery or a place for children to be where they aren't interrupting the worship service, so to speak, and maybe it's okay for them to interrupt the worship service. I mean, what are some things that like we can do in contemporary? When I say contemporary, with time in our present worship environments for this? Is that something, or what? How about this? Here's a better question. What are the problems of some of the contemporary expressions that we should be cautious of?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question, and I have a whole lot of time there. But let me see if I can take a attempt at it. Some children educators talk a lot about edutainment and this tendency for the church to try to say, how do we compete with culture to entertain and to create more and more kind of stimulation for our children? And so I think it can move us into place that we're kind of adopting strategies of culture with technology or stimulation or fun or entertainment, and all of which may have some place. I mean, I think what you hope to do is to create the sense at which children have positive affective experiences, right, with God, with the society, with the social context that they're in. At the same time, my sense is that we've got in our own resources to say, if the essence of our spiritual life is connection with God, and stillness and wonder and contemplation are part of that. That may move us in a different direction. And so
Hmm.
I remember having a conversation with one children's ministry expert, and she was doing an audit of a church. And at some point, somebody asked her, "This is all great. It's a lot of hype and a lot of great activity, but where do your children actually encounter God?" And it was
Wow.
drop the mic moment. And so some of
Wow.
the places that you mentioned, Kathy Stonehouse and her colleagues and others have taken us is to say, how do we create environments where children actually encounter God? And so, what that looks like sometimes in the godly play material is that you might meet with children before they actually enter the space in which you're
Hmm.
trying to do education or worship, and say, let's calm our hearts and let's prepare ourselves, and let's be quiet in this environment because we want to respect other people's places with God. And so there's some of the work that comes out of there is again trying to create what does storytelling do? So I love the name of your podcast in some ways. It
Oh,
can
thanks.
kind of place of how do you tell a story in such a way that it engages a child's imagination? And so
Mm.
again, sometimes this is done with actual objects and figures. There's actually a movement out of intergenerational church now where pastors are exploring what it looks like to do sermons through the aspects of godly play and invite the
Okay.
congregation into these places of asking, I wonder what this is, soliciting from the congregation their own kind of what do they see in the story. Some other interesting kind of work are prayer grounds, which is
Mm.
almost like you bring what looks like childhood play equipment actually into the church setting, so that there's a natural place. The literature that suggests that some kids tune in better if they're actually able to be kind of kinesthetic in their movements. But to try to say, can you create that in such a way that it engages the child liturgically is kind of also intriguing. So again, behind that, I think, is the emphasis upon what is the environment, what is the setting, what's the content, and how do children engage and have experiences with God.
One of the things that I learned from Dr. Ellsworth Callis, who was, president for 3 years at Asbury Seminary, was my preaching professor, and then even after seminary, engaged him for several years. Was he encouraged me to think about first person preaching, and
Mm.
then I also did some other work on that later. And it was a few years into pastoral ministry when I actually started to do it, and about 2 or 3 times a year. So I was a senior pastor for 15 years. I would do a first person sermon. Now I'm not an actor. I'm a dramatic person, but I'm not really an actor. So I felt somewhat inadequate for it. But one of the things that I realized that when I would do it was that the certain people, and not only children or small children, but I made sure that small children were there. That was a time where everybody would be in. The level of engagement in people's eyes and their bodies. It, uh, I know what people look like. One of the things about preaching that's this mystery is how you engage people when you're in while you're through nonverbals, and those change dramatically when I would do a first person sermon, and particularly with children. Like I felt like I was connecting to them in a way I hadn't before. And I've tried to get in my classes. I force I teach preaching, so I force students to do it, and they hate it. Like they don't want to do it, but generally when they do it, they like it, and then they start to have these experiences too. But I think what this is engaging people where they are with story in a way they might not have experienced other times.
That's so good. And I think, that particular stage at which kids are operating out of a sense of unilateral respect, where daddy can do anything, right? It's a good indication that they're at a stage at which they endow people who are bigger and smarter than they are with almost superhuman kind of characteristics. But to tell the stories of the faith, to use first person kind of things, to elevate the role models, I think, is particularly salient during that stage of development. And you're reminding me too, Andy, just another piece of
Yeah,
kind of oftentimes how the kind of current stage that we're in, right? So Jonathan Haidt and others are writing
yeah,
this what's happened to this generation, especially that's so immersed in technology. And so
right,
he contrasts what he calls the historical kind of way that we had a play-centered childhood with now a screen-based kind of childhood. And so
right.
what happens formationally in the child when they're always stuck behind a screen, that tends to be kind of an atomistic and individual kind of experience. And it tends to be indoors, and doesn't connect you with nature, with other people, those kinds of things. So he's one that's really advocating, right, that we
Oh yeah,
reclaim the sense of wonder that comes from engagement with creation, the kind of moderate risk childhood activities that require some sense of rigor, some sense of navigating the kind of relational dynamics that happen on a playground, all of those kind of things that could be important. So I think those can also have important implications for the way we think about children's Christian education and worship kind of environments.
yeah. Oh, I've found his work to be helpful, like the anxious generation, that those concepts that are in that book. And also the screens. This has changed so much of what it means to raise children. And even if you're taking a stand against that, holding off on screens, holding off on smartphones, your children are still in a world where that's what's happening with their peers. So that's one of those real challenges. Now I'm starting to get on the downward slope of that. So our kids are 18, 16, and 14. And we were pretty, like, for instance, video games. Like, I just was, we didn't enter that world. Please don't hear me being judgmental of anybody, even adults who play video games. I'm sorry. But that was just a sense that we wanted to do that. Now, there were some periods where our kids were wondering, man, um, we, I wasn't able to do anything when I was with these friends. But now, particularly my boys, who are my oldest two, they thank me, like, thank you for not letting us play video games. Thank you for like holding off on the screens. And now, like, there's just another book that I saw called Glow Kids, like, with people who they end up having their primary sense of understanding of the world come through an iPad. I've seen babies, like, on, 1-year-olds on their iPads, and that's like how they're pacified. So I think I'd love to hear, like, your thoughts on screens in general too. I know you just highlighted Jonathan Haidt a little bit, but I mean, go ahead and push us a little bit if there's a problems that maybe even confront our primary responsibility of making disciples.
Yeah. It's, again, such a multifaceted
I
question.
know. I'm sorry. I'm throwing it all at you.
That's kind of the nature of human development, I think. So, yeah, I think on the one hand, there's uh, well, some authors in artificial intelligence have talked about how our smartphones in particular operate in what they call an attention economy. That is, that our attention is a scarce resource. And so culture and marketers and others are always competing for how much of our attention can they capture. Right. And so Steve Jobs and the development of the smartphone was just ingenious in terms of all the mechanisms that are implanted in a smartphone to say, how do I capture and keep and sustain your attention, whether it's with notifications or pop-up screens or the color and the touch of a screen. And so, immediately we are drawn to that. We find that it's pretty easy to operate. It's usually friendly, and it delivers on kind of a worlds of information that we can engage in. But now we're 10 years into the smartphone, and we're suddenly saying, gosh, this has had huge implications for mental health challenges, for anxiety, for depression. This is some of what Jonathan Haidt writes about in The Anxious Generation. Well, if we elevate that to artificial intelligence, what I think artificial intelligence will operate even more so in a relationship economy, right? That if relationships are a scarce resource, then a lot of businesses will say, if the commodity that we're operating in is how do we capture you with quality of relationships and develop loyalty and allegiance, then the development of artificial intelligence, I think, will turn more and more towards saying, guys, can we create chatbots? Can we create robots? What kind of things can operate in such a way that they create greater efficiencies? But they'll move into places, I think, of displacing human beings, right? So whether it's the person you interact when you go through a fast food drive-through and order, or whether it's who serves your table, who brings you your food, who you interact with, even in terms of possibly academic advising or a tutor in education or something else. And so I think, again, the places at which what I think we're finding, well, here's an interesting study that a colleague of mine sent to me, is that, right, we're kind of entering this place in which America is facing the lowest birth rate historically. And some authors are asking, why is that the case? And they think that part of it could be attributed to the fact that if you're just on a screen, then you're not out interacting.
Right.
So courtship even happens differently, and it may be decreasing our incentive for our learning the kind of capacities and competencies that develop healthy relationships and that move toward marriage. So even at the level of, gosh, how are we interacting with each other, and are these helpful kind of places, and what's to come may be a real significant kind of place. Just an interesting thing I discovered recently too, and Pope Leo apparently chose his name in part because Pope Leo the 13th was somebody who was concerned in the Industrial Revolution about the kind of dominance of technocratic kind of bureaucracies. And so Leo chose this name because I think he sees that
Right.
artificial intelligence will be one of the critical signature issues that he'll have to address, especially in the possibilities of displacing workers and the impact it will have upon on human beings. So, just an aside to say, guys,
No.
there's a tsunami coming, right?
Yes, yeah, and of course, for us in theological education, this is a part of that as well. And then, of course, people, trying to detect when people are not writing their own papers and those type of things. Um, I just saw last week that there was somebody who proposed to his AI chatbot, even though he's already married, and there's a whole report on it in a major American newspaper about this person, and it's like a legitimate thing. Like, and he was like he had trained his AI, and now even though he's already married with children, he's so committed to this. Like, true, she feels like he is marrying this chatbot that he's created.
Uh, yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
I think the places at which, right, when we think theologically about human interaction mediating something of God's grace,
Mm.
I don't think there's a way that artificial intelligence. I think we can simulate that, but ultimately, I don't think we can ever get to the place at which we can replace it.
Yeah. One of the things that you talk about in another chapter is the importance of discipline. And, it's the same sort of thing. This is something that comes like human to human, the engagement that we have. Like, I'm interacting with my kids, and you talk in the chapter about parenting as image bearing, that this interaction we have comes even through our discipline. And so I'm interested in what your research has shown you about the way we engage children when they get older and how we correct them. And my kids might not really want me to ask this question, but I am interested. Like, this helps them develop their own moral reasoning, their theological understanding. That's all a part of what happens in our disciplining. So I'd love to hear your insights there.
Yeah. So I think that teaching family discipleship, that used to be, a small part of that class. And I thought, well, it's important to pay attention to, but it's relatively kind of simple. And awakening to just how profound those encounters are, I think elevated that for me. And so you think about the Proverbs and how much emphasis there is on listen to wisdom and the corrective kind of functioning of a parent or an older kind of person. And then it became reading again some social scientists. So Martin Hoffman is somebody who talks a lot about discipline encounters, and says that especially when a child is 2 to 3, that there's I don't know, something like thousands of corrective kind of actions that a parent takes during those years, and that in some ways this continues to through the adolescent years and those kind of places. And Hoffman suggests that he categorizes discipline encounters in 2 or 3 different ways. He says that sometimes we use what he calls kind of pressure tactics, or kind of power kind of moves, right? And there are places at which that's maybe necessary. A child's running to the street and there's a car coming, that, in a sense, you've got to intervene and act quickly. There are also love withdrawing kind of techniques where you almost threaten a child by saying, I won't love you if you do
Yeah.
that kind of behavior. And so when you extrapolate that and say, what's being taught to the child, what's being impressed upon the child in those encounters, then there's all the issues of what's the justice of God, what's the love of God. How do those tie into questions about discipleship? So a lot of discipline, or maybe I should move to parenting styles. When we think about parenting styles, oftentimes say, how do you distinguish parenting styles? What are the dimensions that separate one kind of parenting from another? And oftentimes those categories move in the direction of how much warmth is shown to a child, and how much discipline or how much kind of control tactics are there. So in the social sciences, these become connected to parenting style research that says it kind of uses 4 different categories for parenting. So one of those would be the authoritarian style of parenting.
Mhm.
Authoritarian parenting usually relies upon things like "I told you so." It's usually um, pretty oriented toward power or control. Um, Oftentimes, it doesn't provide a lot of negotiation with the child. If you contrast that to an authoritative style, again, the wording is kind of tricky, but authoritarian versus authoritative parenting still maintains control, but it oftentimes uh, gives particular principles or directions by offering the reason for a particular disciplinary action. It gives more freedom for the child to respond and to kind of develop their own sense of moral reasoning. Um, so it negotiates with the child, and if there
Hmm.
are disciplinary actions, it oftentimes seeks to repair the relationship afterwards. So what we find is that right, sometimes the assumptions that Christians make about parenting is that, gosh, I've got to be the parent. It's good for children to be obedient. So we naturally lean toward the kind of pressure tactics to get children to conform. And I think what we've got to be careful of is that we can get compliance, but have create a place at which there's kind of emotional defection from where the parent's actually trying to move a child. And so a parenting style that moves more toward authoritative seems to develop this capacity for internalizing moral reasoning, right? If you're saying to a child, here's the reasons why we have this particular rule. If there's a chance at which the child, right, at about 3 years old, 2 to 3 years old, a child will start to say no, and we can judge that as defiance and try to break the will of the child or simply to conform it. Or we could say, wow, the child's developing their own sense of putting the world together with some kind of sense of autonomy. And if it is defiance, it probably needs to be constrained or channeled. But there is a place at which the that's indicating that a child's growing moral sensitivities are developing. And so, how do we bring that into a conversation to help them reason about that, so that the conscience and the
Mm.
internal moral compass is being developed, rather than staying external to the child, located simply in the having to conform to a parent's kind of wishes. So, when you connect all of that again to image bearing, I think there's a lot in terms of, right, how does God discipline us? What are we learning about the nature of God in these discipline encounters that have some pretty significant kind of implications, I think, for oftentimes the way that we translate the justice of God, the character of God, how God actually leads us, right? Is he a punishing God? Is he an authoritarian kind of God? Is he on the opposite side would be also a permissive parenting style, right?
Hmm.
God so hands off that it's almost a sense that he's a grandparent who says go and have fun, and I'm not really involved in what your activities are. So again, I think we're impressing a lot of image bearing upon a child in those discipline encounters, and so to think more deeply about it and think about our own assumptions. So in that chapter, I also give about 20 statements just for parents to think about in terms of what are their assumptions about parenting. For instance, do you feel like it's important for your children to know that you're the authority figure? Uh,
Mm.
do you ever feel like you're losing control when you're disciplining a child? What are the emotions that you feel, and how does that take issue? So how connected you stay with a child, even in a discipline encounter, I think becomes pretty significant.
You mentioned this contrast between authoritarianism and then authoritative. And I remember one of the things, again, this was type of one of the beauties of going to seminary as a couple is that you kind of like learn a little bit of what the other person's learning. And I think you introduced this to Abby. And so this also shows my age. So it's 20 years ago we graduated 2005, but I think you introduced it's called Hardwired to Connect
Right.
study, and it was this the what it emphasized, I think, was the importance of fostering authoritative communities. And so we've leaned back on that research quite a bit. But I'm curious, Has that held up? It's 20 years old now. Have those ideas, are they still things that are foundational or are helpful in your discipline?
I sure think so, Andy. I mean, essentially that was a report of like 33 specialists in the area of um, human development, social science, even medical, I think, professions. And they were essentially saying that what seems to be missing in our culture is what they called morally authoritative communities.
Mm,
Authoritative was drawing from this research on parenting styles and contrasting those authoritarian versus authoritative communities. But those were essentially kind of the notion of a group of people who had a shared understanding of what good was, and were communicating this intergenerationally from one generation to another. And so again, yeah, that authoritative place, I think that really has held up in terms of um, where you can find that, you develop healthy and good and resilient children. And so there is a lot of research that goes into saying if you distinguish these four different kind of parenting styles across these two dimensions, and then you say what kind of outcomes do these different parenting styles produce, then there's a lot of research I think that says that you get the best outcomes with authoritative kind of parenting. I should qualify that just a little bit in saying that there are some cultural differences in that regard,
mm.
right? So there may be places at which an authoritarian kind of parenting style is appropriate. There may be places at which you give more freedom to children in a particular location or at a particular stage of life. But for the most part, I think again the outcome seems to be best in terms of moral reasoning, independence, resilience, those kinds of things that fit with an authoritative kind of parenting style.
That's helpful. When you talk about the different stages, the next stage you talk about is adolescence, and you call this the place where we need to have the share in the power of creation. And so this is moving to a different position, not just kind of creating the foundation, but now they're taking that foundation and doing something with it as they create their own identities. And one of the things I think of the challenges that my kids face, my teenagers face, that I didn't, was the impact of this sexual revolution, the normalization of homosexuality. Um, I did not have to think about. Uh, I hardly knew. Now I was maybe a little more sheltered than some, but I hardly even knew what the word gay or any the alphabet of LGBTQ plus was not anywhere in like the framework of my development even before I graduated high school, really. And so now there's with the social contagion of people thinking they're another gender. It's like our children are faced with this change in our culture, and it's like they have to almost make a decision of who they are. And so it's this real just trying to root things in scripture for like in Abby's and my own parenting, and a theology of the body has been a helpful way forward on this. But this idea of being a creative entity person, like as we're doing this, like there's some dangers and some things to be cautious of as they form their identity in these years. So I'd be curious how you could unpack this for us and like help us think like how we disciple in this phase. Not, pretty small question, Chris, forgive me, but these are the type of things that what I was thinking about. I was looking at that chapter is like, this is a complicated but critical time.
Mhm. Yeah, the power of creation. I chose that phrase. It actually comes out of a program called Journey to Adulthood, and it was a church, a couple of churches that said, "Gosh, we've found ourselves in confirmation, kind of saying that if we can just get our kids through confirmation, then we've kind of done our job of a parenting." But
Okay.
the church was saying that that was the exit point for a lot of children from faith community. Right, you get through
Mm.
confirmation, and about the age of 16, you start exiting from the faith community, and so you start navigating your adult life without a lot of resources from the faith community. So what I loved about the power of creation, though, so they suggest in this program that we need to surround youth, right? Instead of them becoming a tribe apart, we really need to create this relational infrastructure that can guide them through this journey. Um, So part of that was what they called Rite 13, and this was a liturgical way of acknowledging the arrival of pubescence.
Mm-hmm.
They use the language of the power of creation, that essentially, with the pubescence, you're given the capacity to create life. And so you're sharing in this unbelievable kind of capacity to bring another immortal human being
Yeah.
into existence. And so when I thought about, gosh, what I want to communicate to I have two boys, what I want to communicate to them, oftentimes what I said to them about that stage of life is that, your body's changing and you're developing the capacity to produce semen. And so this is an incredible gift of sharing with God the capacity for bringing life into existence. And so encouraging, rather than following kind of the cultural narratives in that regard, what does it look like to say, this is a gift that comes from your creator? So I hope that in relationship with him, you'll understand how to live that with integrity and with stewarding that great gift that was there. But the power of creation, so it connects not only to sexuality, but to what we know about human development in terms of hypothetical thinking. So where it ties into identity formation is now I've got this capacity to imagine who I can become and to kind of play with those various scenarios. And of course, vocationally, then it has a lot of implications as well. But to get back to where you were talking about sexuality, Andy, I think again, yeah, the place at which it seems to me that what used to be almost taboo for us growing up has now almost become kind of like what the culture says is this is your agenda to explore who you are
Yeah.
sexually, right? And so to try to say, I think sometimes we've been fearful in Christian communities to talk a lot about sexuality, but silence probably creates more confusion than it does create helps. And similar to where you were talking earlier, right? If we don't do this, then where do kids turn for their information? And
Right.
they turn to social media. And so again, it's those kind of things that will end up discipling our children. Um, so I try to unpack at least to some level in the book, kind of what are some of the distorted messages about sexuality that kids are growing up with today, and especially then how do we create other kinds of narratives and story. Um, Interesting that so this will tie in a little bit with the young adult chapter two. Um, but interesting, there was some research about looking at families and trying to say what are the kinds of practices that they engage in today, right? What's happening
Mm-hmm.
with what we used to talk about as being family altars and family discipleship kind of things. And the author, Diana Garland, was initially kind of discouraged that she didn't find a whole lot of information about that there are families that are actually doing a whole lot of those kinds of practices. But what she did find is that they do a lot of storytelling. And
Mm.
storytelling, there's oftentimes aspects of what's valuable in our faith that's communicated. So stories about birth, how was your name chosen, what was going on in our family when you were born. Um, Stories about death. You know, when Grandma died, we all gathered at the church and we remembered her life and we prayed in that regard. So I think it's interesting to think about. First of all, how do we help families tell stories that convey issues of faith, but then also, especially then, if Freud, right? There's lots that we would be skeptical about Freudian kind of psychology. But one of the things that he said that caught me at one point is he said that he thought that love and work were the two themes of the adult life.
Mm.
So I committed some time in the chapters, especially in young adulthood, to say, what are the cultural stories that are told about love? What are the stories that we internalize? And what's different about the Christian narrative? Right.
Mm.
So whereas the cultural narrative now says, gosh, cohabitation is the pattern to follow. So, right, kick the tires, engage in sexual activity, explore this until you find out who you are, is a much different message, I think, than saying our bodies actually have something to tell us about who we are as male and female. That there's a lot about embodiment that's critical in the Christian narrative. Furthermore, that moving toward marriage, right? The aspects of having a liturgy that embodies the making of a promise communicates something to you, to your partner, to God, and to the community that you're going in about what your intention is, and that has more glue for creating faithfulness than the pattern of cohabitation that seems to set one up for more disagreements in marriage, for less faithfulness to the vows that are committed, and so a lot of different kind of contrasts in that regard.
It's very like I like how you're kind of making this transition. I know you've thought a lot and you've published about young adulthood already. And like I'm curious what's new in this book as you talk about this, because you had a book earlier about young adulthood. So I'm just interested to see like cultures change and always changing as relate to this. And there are multiple ways and there's rival pathways in Christian formation as it's I mean, I guess it's everywhere, but I just think particularly these adolescents and young adult years is coming at everybody in different directions. So how's that? How do we encourage young adults to think about the story that they're in at this phase?
Yeah, so the what was new, or what I was trying to do with in the book that's kind of different from the earlier work, was in a sense that some social scientists are kind of taking these mega perspectives on what kind of competencies show up, what kind of theory can we build across the whole of the lifespan, and so some of them are saying that what becomes especially kind of an emergent capacity in young adulthood is the way that we story our lives. So they talk about this as we become the authors of our own kind of
Right.
life. So this dovetails with what counselors are telling us about narrative therapy, and the whole aspect again about what's the narrative, what's the story we tell about ourselves, what's the story that we're adopting, what's the story about what is the good life, and what are the means to achieve it. To pick up some of what others have done, like James Smith in cultural liturgies and these kinds of things. So again, if Freud was right about love and work being these two dominant themes, what I wanted to do is kind of say what's the intersection of these. So if a young adult is trying to say, what do I do during the college years? There's some interesting literature that suggests why do college students get engaged in binge drinking, for example? And the sociologists that study this will say that it's largely, when you drill down to it, they say, well, that's just what the social script told us we were supposed to do.
Interesting.
And so if you begin to ask kind of what are the social scripts that are kind of communicating to people, what do you do with these years? Some of the interesting things I think is that when you look at how do young people talk about what it means to be an adult, and again,
Mm,
what seems to be developing in that regard is that they oftentimes will name things like when I make my own decisions. It's
mm,
it's when I become financially independent. It's when I
mm-hmm,
take responsibility for my life. Historically, we connected those more toward things like getting married or bearing children that again have this element of care for someone else. So right now we're cycling
mm.
all the way back again to these kind of theological kind of
Yeah.
questions about is life mostly about fulfilling the self, or is it about giving my life on behalf of
Wow.
for care and kind of things. So that also applies to work, right? So do you think about work as being um, a kind of self-absorbent kind of place, or is it
Right.
again somehow connecting to loving God, loving other people?
Yeah, I mean, this comes into political realities as well with basic economic systems that are in place. So the kind of assumption behind capitalism is, and I had Brent Waters on my podcast a while back, an ethicist who was formerly at Garrett, and it's a very positive book on capitalism. But he looks at it rewards people when they give, when they offer something, like when you're in service, when you use the economic realities around us to do that. But if instead the idea is to receive, maybe in some forms of socialism, this then like changes the orientation of what's going to happen for the good of society. Now, some people, of course, say that the capitalist system is selfish because you're just looking out for yourself. You're doing it for that end. Well, hopefully there can be this balance between the love and work as well. Like your work is, just looking at and here, those who are watching on YouTube, seeing your bookshelves, right? You've done this work, and certainly it's benefited you and probably the raising of your family, but it's something you offer to the world, offer to me and the podcast and students at this time. Like it's something that you're giving, and certainly there's also a aspect where you're receiving as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, it just strikes me it would if there's not something that is fulfilling, then we probably would have an image of God that's not that's almost like cruel, right?
Right.
I think there's some place at which God knows that this offering of ourselves to others really is also the pathway to fulfillment.
Well,
Yeah.
Chris, like that was where we heard from you in my young adult years, before Abby and I had children. But I'll tell you, I had a very hard moment about a month and a half ago. I was speaking at a church, and it was actually I had just been speaking at a district gathering for the Global Methodist Church, and the person is introducing me, was saying how this is a new phase in the life of the kind of Wesleyan world, and how WBS was leading the way and their president. And he said something like he went, and I was really kind of welling up in my chest a little bit, because he said, and this is the type of young man that we need to, and then he stopped himself. He said, well, no, and he wasn't like actually trying to have a dig on me. He said, I mean, middle-aged man that we need to have in leadership. And so he looked at me, he must have saw the white in my beard or whatever it is. And he said, oh, I was wrong. And he wasn't actually trying to get on to me, but he just like corrected himself and said, no, you're not a young man anymore. So now, Chris, I'm in middle age. I'm 45 years old. You have a chapter on this phase, and this seems to, it might not be as much attention given to old middle-agers. And I'm curious what the social roles are and how we find balance for this. And people are going through all kinds of things. And like in my life, menopause is coming for people. There's all these type of different things, phases that, I just know these things are my life over the next 10 years is changing quite a bit. So what does this chapter offer to people like me?
Yeah. So a good starting point may be, Andy, that Erickson called the middle stage of life the longest and least understood of all the stages of life.
Okay, so, thank you.
That's interesting to say, gosh, it's more difficult to say what should be prescriptive, right? Erickson used to talk about a conceptual itinerary that would help us live. And so when we kind of look around and say, gosh, am I where I'm supposed to be at midlife? It's hard to find what's the metrics that we measure that by. So intriguing are to look back historically, and I do this in the chapter a little bit with how was midlife kind of conceptualized. So you find in the latter part of the 18th century that they called it the staircase. German Lebensstreppe was the name, but it was notion that the pinnacle of the life was at the midpoint.
Okay.
So I think that becomes interesting itself, right? I mean, if we're thinking about sanctification, when do we expect for that to happen, or where does wisdom emerge? Is life an ascent and then a descent? So somebody said to me one time that maybe the book of Job is a commentary on the lifespan, right? That you accumulate things in the mid part of life, and then they begin to be kind of taken away from you. And so, what will you hold on to at that particular place? But there are other places of thinking, is there continuity between the first part of life and the second part of life? What changes and what's different? Interesting comment from Richard Rohr. He suggested that the first half of life, we try to have what we love, and the second half of life, we learn to love what we have. So we can also think about, are there changes in terms of what scriptures appeal to us in the second part of life? Are there differences that we pay attention to? But the social roles become interesting, because I think it is the place at which, if you start to name what are the roles that you are carrying at midlife, right? There's usually 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 7 family roles. So I'm a son taking care of older parents. I'm a parent taking care of younger kids. I'm a spouse. I've got a professional kind of a work role. I'm an uncle, all these kind of things. And you suddenly realize that, gosh, when you put all those together, first of all, we oftentimes talk about role overload. That's a burden at midlife. Um, I like one author that said it's not just one calling that we have; it's multiple callings. And part of the
Mm,
challenge is how do you balance those different callings? Um, it's also interesting that at the same time that adolescents are going through identity formation, a lot of what midlife seems to be is this kind of internal evaluation of some literature that says that men in particular have a sense of where they expected to be at midlife, whether it's mid-level manager at a company or whether it's pastoring a high steeple church.
right.
I've accomplished these kind of things. And so sometimes if there's a gap between what they idealized and where they currently are, then the midlife journey is how you reconcile those. Or for others, it may be that, yeah, I've accomplished all of this, but I had to invest so much in order to get there that there were some other things that were neglected along the way. And so are there relationship deficits that I now need to address or those kinds of things? Um, for women, it can oftentimes be, again, the connected to menopause is how you pass through menopause may depend upon this balance of work and mothering. What place have you given both of those in your life, and what then does menopause mean in that regard? So what I tried to do with the chapter then, and to say, gosh, are there what kinds of things would be helpful to inform that? And so what seemed to emerge for me were practices, and of course we could talk at any stage of life about important kind of Christian practices that would inform this life, but things like Sabbath keeping. What does Sabbath look like? What does solitude, in which you are actually giving yourself space for reflection about how you're living those roles, what meaning they have, what balance to give to them? What's the significance of hospitality and spiritual friendship? And then how do you practice discernment in the midst of all of that, right? These places at which so many things seem to come at you, and you can get this overwhelming feeling of well, for me, maybe I should own this. And I can come to this place and say, gosh, I've got these bookshelves. I'm a Christian educator. I should know how to do all of this. And yet there are these relationship challenges in family life and other places that leave you humble and say, gosh, I've got to, how do I manage this situation? How do I, again, bear image to something of the nature of God as I'm going through them? At the same time that sometimes it feels like we're kind of groping in the dark, looking for answers and crying out in desperation for saying, God, be my helper and help me to live through this faithfully.
Yeah. Did you just have a listening session in, like you bugged my house, as I was praying this morning in my yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is like these interesting phases of these roles that we have and how we manage them and how we work through these various tensions that come. Yeah, well, I really encourage people to take a look at that chapter. And this book as a whole is really whetting my appetite for it, Chris. And thank
Oh,
you.
good.
You guys sent me a copy of the kind of like just the PDF file, but I need to get this book all together. I feel like there's so much more that I want to look at. I'm curious. You brought up Jonathan Haidt, and also in the last 10 years or so, Jordan Peterson's become a kind of prominent voice thinking about human development. And a lot of the same type of authors that you cite, Piaget and Erickson, and like these are kind of like just flow off his tongue, and people are listening a lot to him. And I've benefited to a certain degree from some of the things I've heard on podcasts and YouTube and the like. But at the same time, I have some caution. Just curious, I didn't tell you this question was coming, so you could say, Andy, you didn't tell me you're going to ask that and skip it. But I'm curious your thoughts on Jordan Peterson and maybe some of these popular psychological voices outside the Christian perspective and what we might be able to learn from them, or should we just be pretty cautious?
Yeah. Um, Gosh, I think I would almost have to piece that one apart some.
Okay.
where to be precautionary and where can it be helpful. So I think those are important voices. I think they're interesting to listen to. Um, I do find myself sometimes feeling like, how, again, how do their perspectives fit in with a biblical theological kind of perspective? And again, are they being informed by what we regard as being the Spirit of God and biblical truth? Or are they
Yes.
being informed more by social science kind of things? Not that I'm always wary of social science, but again, what's the motivation? What's the aim? What's the direction? So that's very generic, Andy. Maybe not
No,
even.
that's good. That's good. I'll have to have you back to talk about. No, but I think that that's helpful. It's like, what's the teleos? Like, where are things headed? And I think that it starts with a different. It starts at a different place
Mm.
than the reality of a God who creates the universe and has revealed himself through the scriptures and his way and exists as three persons in loving fellowship. If that's not the foundation, it just seems like it can get off from time to time. And yeah, I can appreciate the words to think about different phases and the ways that roles play out. But I know that you're in that same literature in a way I'm not. So I appreciate the kind of very subtle caution. I'm sorry we don't have time to get into the last chapter, which is really interesting, but I hope that that will just help people maybe want to get this book. But it talks about the older adulthood and dying well and thinking about these phases. So I'll have to tell people to check that out themselves. But Chris, one of the things I always ask people is if there's more to the story of Chris, for instance, something maybe you don't get to talk about very often, or you wouldn't talk about. Is there a hobby or something that's interesting to you, or something maybe in this phase of your life that's new that you like to share?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I was engaged in a Wabash Center offered a midlife kind of colloquium for a while, and the project was to adopt some kind of hobby. So I took on woodworking at the time. My
Ah,
father's an engineer, and so as a child, oftentimes had opportunities to be with him in the garage and build soapbox cars or those kind of things. So I've done a little bit of that, Andy. I don't have a space yet to fully engage in woodworking kind of craft, but we've again at midlife, right? The older generation is passing away, so we inherited some furniture. So I refinished my great grandfather's old hutch, and
wow.
part of the Wabash Center was also thinking about engaging in that craft. How does that inform pedagogy? And so
Huh.
I find it really fascinating to think about, right? So much of education is pushing us to say, gosh, how do we make sure we keep our numbers up? How do we get more students in classes? And so it can feel a little bit like the kind of mass producing, right, of cranking out those kind of things. And yet the woodworking, especially the people that I connected with, were like master craftsmen, and so they were, they would produce a particular kind of output. They'd make an armoire. And once they made one armoire, it was kind of like, okay, I've done that, and that's a unique piece, and I'm done with it. So this notion of what does pedagogy look like when you're functioning as a master craftsman and you're
Mm.
studying the grain of a student's life and trying to say, how do I sand with that grain instead of against it? Or how do I bring that into full fruition? That had some interesting kind of implications for it. So I guess that's something that still intrigues me, Andy, and along with gardening and woodworking, and still like exercise and workouts when I can get them in. So yeah.
That's great. Oh, what if the Wabash Center? So is help me. What's that group? Maybe I should know about them.
Uh, they're a group out in Tennessee that offer a lot of grants for folks to. The midlife colloquium was to intersect folks at midlife, but they also do a lot with issues of race and
Hmm.
higher education. And so, yeah, we're checking
How
out
interesting.
kind of things that they offer.
Interesting. Well, again, friends, I hope you'll check out Chris's book, Discipleship for Every Stage of Life, Understanding Christian Formation in Light of Human Development. Chris, thank you for your scholarship and for getting this material for us. and helping us understand it in a deeper way. I hope that this kind of just gave people a little sense of this work, and that they'll get your book and see how it can help them think about the end of life and the goal that is kind of at the very essence of who we are as people. So thanks for your time today.
My pleasure. And my great honor to be on your podcast, Andy. Thanks so much.